most places, this afternoon in some. Paul is here heading late into the night, but we're grateful that you all could take the time to be with us and to talk together today, and very grateful that, that Paul and Christine can be here to talk with us about their wonderful new books. So welcome, first of all, to Paul Hedges and Christine Hong, our authors. And thank you to all of the co-sponsors who helped to get the word out about this, schools and centers and journals and associations who are all doing vital work related to interreligious studies and engagement. I'm Rachel Mikva. I'm a professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, co-chair of the American Academy of Religion, Interreligious and Interfaith Studies Program Unit, and senior faculty fellow at our Interreligious Center. We're going to ask each of our authors to talk approximately for 10 minutes about their book, including a bit about how they came to write it. As Christine might say, as she kind of says in her book at one point, we're going to begin to story ourselves into each other's lives. And after each author presents, I'll ask a couple basic follow-up questions. And then after both are done, the three of us will dig in briefly to the rich conversation that emerges between these books as they imagine what it is to decolonize religious studies and theological education. And we're going to save at least the last 15 minutes for your questions and comments. There are a lot of us on the call today, so we're going to ask you to write them into the chat. You can write them, you can add them as we go, or wait till the end to see which one of your questions rises to the top. We'll be done in an hour and we'll stop recording then, but we invite those who are directing or working at centers or journals related into religious studies to stay on just for a few minutes for a quick brainstorm about potential synergies going forward. So with no further ado, I'll begin by asking Paul if you would go ahead and start.
Okay, thanks very much, Rachel. And
you're very soft to me. I think also to you, Christine. Is he hard to hear? We need you louder.
Okay, I'll try and be a bit louder. Late night here, and it's so I don't know if that affects anything. Anyway, thank you very much, Rachel, and to everyone for being here for this. So yes, we're obviously here to talk about the books. So understanding religion was a bit of a labor of love. It took me about 6 years from my first sort of writing of drafts and putting proposals together to actually seeing the physical thing coming out. So it was a huge sort of undertaking in this. And when I first started writing it, I thought, oh, it's just a textbook. This would be quite a quick book to write, no problem at all. But as I was underway sort of within it, it was clear to me that one, to be on top of all of the topics, and of course I covered, well, there's 18 chapters in there, so effectively 18 different topics, to be on top of that was a huge work in itself. And also as I wrote it, because it seems like such a long text, about just over 200,000 words, to get all those sort of layers together, I realized I was doing more than, if you like, simply writing a textbook. In a sense, it was something like an intervention into the field. And I was taking on a lot of sort of battles on sort of theoretical levels to bring all of this together and make sense of it. So I said it was an incredibly long time to get it done, and all of my thanks go to California University Press, who are absolutely wonderful in this. Now, as Rachel said, we'll maybe talk a little bit about why I wrote it. Now, it was just about 6 years ago till I arrived where I currently am in Singapore. I'd been at the same university in the UK for about 10 years before that. And this, to some extent, it sort of builds out of, I guess, about sort of 20 plus years of sort of teaching experience as well, to where I've got to today. But I was teaching in a school, it's a School of International Relations. The courses I currently teach is a graduate school. So I'm teaching graduate students who are mostly from Asian studies, and that's basically Asian politics is their primary interest, with international relations students from strategic studies coming in, and I'm doing a course on method and theory in the study of religion. And of course, to most of them, why am I talking about sort of definitions of religion? Why am I sort of making the secular into like this big deal? And to make sense to them from where they were coming from, I realized basically there was nothing, if you like, out there that I could sort of take as a one-stop resource to try and explain a lot of these debates to them. So while it is, if you like, it's a straight religious studies textbook, it's not primarily an interreligious studies book, but I kind of mentioned, because my background in interreligious studies, this affects how I write it. It's basically a religious studies textbook. But it was written sort of partly to sort of help explain sort of why, you know, people from international relations should be interested in this sort of religious studies debates, which partly explains sort of like the case study method I use. That if you like, there are real world practical sort of implications for this. It's not just scholars in ivory tower saying, well, we don't really quite know what religion means, and it could mean this and it could mean that. But you know, there are legal aspects to this. There are political debates within this, and some of this actually struck me while I was writing this book. I was teaching it, and a few years back I was going through sort of some of, I've been using these drafts for my students for quite some time, and at the end of sort of one semester, one of the students sort of got to me and said, now I understand what you're teaching us, that the whole of religion is political, everything is political. And I hadn't quite looked at it that way before, but I said, yeah, you're right. That's kind of what I was doing. And of course, linking this in again, the last time I finished teaching this, it was about 2 months ago. So actually just, the book came out sort of about 2 weeks before I actually finished teaching the course. So the students were the last ones to work with my sort of, my PDF sort of versions. And one of the students there on her feedback basically made the comment, I really enjoyed this course. Paul showed us that everything to do with religion is basically about decolonization. We have to decolonize everything from top to bottom to understand that. And again, I was thinking, well, actually, you know, we did decolonization quite a bit through the course. And then again, oh yeah, well, actually, everything in this is more or less about decolonization in another sense. So as well as, if you like, sort of me trying to explain religion to other people, it's helped me to explain more about how I understand religion as well myself, particularly the way I teach it. And so that's come out of this. Now, having said I've, you know, written it, if you like, for, in a sense, for my current context of international relations students and Asian studies students, again, sort of having spent sort of 15 years before that sort of teaching primarily straight religious studies, again, this book was obviously written for them because there's very few people out there in international relations actually doing religious studies courses. So it was mainly sort of written, if you like, into this religious studies space, just sort of work. Yes, there's lots of textbooks out there, but I never used a textbook before. I never found textbooks completely satisfying. So partly it was to sort of, you know, give me a text that I would actually want to use for this. And also in each chapter, I've put in sort of 2 case studies at the end to make it sort of quite flexible as well. So there may be particular religions people sort of teach, some they don't teach. So hopefully that gives more flexibility. And again, of course, the 18 chapters as well. I mean, it's a lot more than I actually teach. And actually some chapters in here I have never taught, but there were things I know had to be in here, if you like, to make it a complete textbook. So the cognitive science of religion is a subject I've never taught in my life. And it's something I knew something about, but basically, you know, over that 6 years, part of it was educating myself, you know, on this whole sort of topic. And again, some of this was fascinating because again, that weaves into all sorts of stuff. My stuff on comparison also works out from that sort of cognitive science of religion. So I said it was a huge sort of labour of love and sort of this kind of sort of intellectual undertaking in my own mind as well, where I started to sort of, you know, really sort of see how I was understanding things. I guess the other aspect is partly around sort of debates in what is often called critical religion. So this, if you like, has become sort of this huge sort of, well, I mean, it's a term, it's a slogan, it's also like a movement sort of out there. And myself with some other scholars, I think, you know, we've got a lot of sympathy for the kind of critical ideas that often comes out of critical religion. but we find some of the work in critical religion as if, well, I don't want to put this sort of negatively, but some of it could be better than it is. If you like, there seems to be a lot of sort of assumptions that you've got critical religion scholars sometimes trying to do philosophy and they're not philosophers. So they're kind of sort of making mistakes along the way. So it's trying to say like, well, this is how we really use these critical skills. This is sort of what Foucault sort of might actually mean if we apply him here, rather than sort of going down a very strong sort of deconstructive line. So, I mean, just as an example of this, the first chapter on religion, of course, there's lots of scholars out there now who say, well, let's get rid of this term religion. It's got a problematic sort of background. There's a particular sort of Western Christian heritage, and yes, there is. But as I point out, there's no word in the English language that doesn't have pretty much the same kind of sort of heritage all the way through. The fact that we're speaking English is shaping the very conversation that is possible to have. So unless you stop speaking in English about religion, you're not going to sort of get out of these problems. So, I go against this very strong thing that says we completely sort of chucked this word out the window. But I say, yes, it's a problematic word. We've got to realize, that every time we use this word, we misrepresent the world. But this is true of all the language that we ever use. We're always misrepresenting the world every time we speak. And that's simply what language does. I think maybe just a final bit to put into this, I have a kind of like theoretical basis in my introduction. There's kind of like a short scholarly introduction at the end where I introduce what I call a critical form of sort of hermeneutical phenomenology, which is basically my sort of big theoretical idea underlies, I said, a lot of this book. There's not much of it in the book because it is a textbook for students. As I mentioned in introduction, if I'd written a 60,000 word introduction, then the publishers would have smacked me around the head a bit and cut that bit out. So there's this sort of introduction in there, but basically all the way through the book, as I said, it all ties together, I think, in a sense. So you can see, if you like, these critical ideas, hermeneutical philosophy sort of coming in, and all sorts of sort of things which come together to tie, if you like, this central focus to see how we understand religion, life, society. There's again, in a sense, this is a book about religion, but it's not, in one sense, a theory book about religion. It's how we understand the world, because of course this is where religion takes place. So I think, students, again, who have no interest in religion could read this book and enjoy the theory in it for how it helps us think about the world around us. So, religion, if you like, is what I'm writing about, but it's not the be all and end all of this book. I'm not sure if that's my 10 minutes, but hopefully if it's not, more time for questions.
So the book is, I mean, it's very rich. It's got these digestible, focused chapters. It has these boxes that explain all kinds of things that your students and our students might not know even what they are, but we throw these terms around all the time and they're too embarrassed to ask or they don't remember. And it has these wonderful case stories of real world implications and applications. So a colleague said that she's adopting your book for a course this fall, and she wanted to ask, well, I'll ask in her stead, what are some of the ways that you envision using this book in courses, especially since you've already done it?
Right, okay, thank you. So it's an excellent question. I said, I don't think there's a single way to use this book. And again, I said, because of where I'm currently sitting, sort of in a graduate school to sort of political science students mainly, the way I teach this book is different from how I would teach it to straight religious studies students. And again, if I was in an interreligious sort of context, again, I would teach it in a different way as well. I mean, without wanting to go into details, but what I do firstly, I actually start with chapter 18, my final chapter on politics when I'm teaching it. So basically, we come straight in, if you like. I said, as these students come in, none of them, well, hardly any of them have ever had any background in religious studies. There are some who've got some form of theological education for their own traditions. But of course, this tends to be very different, if you like, from a critical sort of religious studies approach to these traditions. So it's bringing them the fact that, that these are, as I said, these are real world disputes. These abstract ideas have practical implications. And also the fact that the way we typically think about this is also sort of misconstruing stuff. Because again, if we think about sort of religion normally, we'll sort of see it as like sets of beliefs which lead into sort of certain actions, and that's just simply not the way these traditions work. So I bring that in first, sort of to help ground them, that if you want to go back to your areas, and some of these people out there, they're civil servants coming in to do sort of further study and sort of around this stuff. And of course, they deal with religious communities, and particularly here in Southeast Asia, religion is still such a huge part of life. They need to know something about this, which is partly why the courses are here in the Asian studies around politics. So, they often perhaps get it in ways that some Western students wouldn't get it. If you like, sort of why religion and politics sort of tie in so well together. I then take them through that, then chapter 1 on religion, then into secularism, and that then sort of, if you like, shows them sort of why we need to go into these debates. Now, I normally use just one of the case studies each week in class, simply because, to use it sort of fully, there's simply not time. So I have actually got 3-hour classes, and obviously break those up somewhat with a couple of breaks in between. But what I've been doing is I start off just a couple of minutes sort of talk for me, and then I leave the students for 15 minutes, say, okay, just discuss this chapter. What are your questions about it? What are your problems? And then I let the students come back to me, well, this is something I didn't understand, that's something else I didn't understand within this. And then use that, if you like, into a further discussion around it. Then the final hour is simply based on one of the case studies. So we spent an hour talking about one of the case studies as well. Now, I think maybe something else sort of Rachel mentioned, if you like, I said a lot of these text boxes are explaining terms that people don't know. And again, I think partly my context has given me this, because again, particularly coming from the UK as I was before in America, there's often an assumption that students will know particularly like sort of Christian terms. And of course, these days, students won't know their Bible, they won't know these Christian terms. And of course, being here in Southeast Asia, I've got students from Islamic backgrounds, Buddhist backgrounds, Hindu backgrounds, and of course, they will know nothing at all about this. So it's really sort of helped me to sort of, if you like, take a step back from even where I was before, to assume that students know nothing. And that's, if you like, one of the bases of this book. It starts off with this assumptions of absolute ignorance on the part of students. But I said, hopefully as well, takes them up to a level where we can sort of get on and do other stuff. And again, because I'm teaching graduate students, I have to take them fairly deep in. So when we do, if you like, a chapter on social constructionism, we've got a chapter from sort of Pierre Bourdieu that we read alongside this. So they've got like the primary text with those as well. So each week I've normally got like one chapter from here, then normally a more difficult primary sort of text. And if you like, hopefully my introduction eases them into that chapter. And I said we can go through that. Yep, so hopefully that answers.
Yeah, it does. It does. And interestingly, I still remember the first Hindu student, Vaishnava Hindu student, who came into a history of Christian thought class at CTS and said, in the first session, who's Paul, right? They were just talking about Paul. Said, who's Paul? And it was so important for everybody, because the students who thought they knew who Paul was, having to figure out how would you explain Paul, was really a learning experience, and for the professor as well. And a whole bunch of students who wouldn't have dared ask who's Paul, because they were supposed to know, right? But this woman who'd grown up in India had no point of reference for that. All of that definitional work even is can be very transformative. Normally I would hold up the book, but I have them both on, here's Christine's on my phone. But there you go. Thank you. Understanding Religion. It's a wonderful work. Thank you. Christine, would you talk a little bit about your wonderful book?
Thank you. And first, I want to thank Paul for his wonderful book. I can't wait to be in conversation later in this talk about how to use it and how to use it well. And I'm already envisioning ways, Paul, in which it's going to be in good dialogue with some of the things that I'm teaching here at Columbia. So I wrote this book. This this book took me about maybe 4 years really to kind of come together. It was initially a collection of essays just about my experience teaching in what I really think is a predominantly, white and often white supremacist paradigm oriented academy, Christian, hegemonic, often Christian supremacist ideologies that are sort of embedded in a lot of our institutions of teaching and learning. And the impetus of the book came just out of my time. I spend a lot of time for my service really mentoring doctoral students, and they're primarily doctoral students of color at organizations like FTE and Louisville Institute. Excuse me. And I've noticed that in my time of spending with doctoral students going through their various programs in various fields, that they tend to teach earlier and earlier in their programs. So, I mean, when I went through my program, I was really encouraged to hold off on taking an adjunct position or teaching a class on my own until I was ABD or almost done. Excuse me. But I've noticed that a lot of, especially doctoral students of color, tended to be pulled into those teaching assignments and those teaching positions early and earlier. And it had to do with a couple of things. It had to do, one, with number one, income. Higher education is really expensive, and none of us are going in the field of religious and interreligious educations. None of us are going to, maybe some of us might, but most of us won't be billionaires. So this idea that you kind of have to start, making money to make ends meet early, even if it's small gains really of an adjunct position is really necessary. Also, adjuncts are cheap labor for institutions. So I felt a lot of tension with that. Students early in their program needing to focus on learning how to teach, learning things on their own, coming up with their own ideas, now spending their energy teaching for really pennies, right, at institutions that could pay them more, but refused to and saw them as cheap labor. And so that was disturbing to me and continues to be disturbing to me. I also noticed that the competitive nature of hiring got worse every year. So students, their CVs, by the time they went up for their first teaching job full time, whether it was a contract job or a tenure track job, it was comparable to people going up for tenure a few years earlier, honestly. They were publishing, people had books before they even went up for their first jobs. And I felt like doctoral students of color especially had this feeling about needing to do more, double, triple, religiously minoritized students as well, in order to remain competitive in theological education, which still tends to be predominantly white and Christian. And it was because the institutions that were calling them to apply really presumed their incompetence first, right? So they had to meet some kind of imaginary bar that it seemed like only they could see at their institutions. And so this was really, it mirrored a lot of my own experience, but it was worse in many ways than what I had experienced. So coupled with that, and then I also had my own share of experiences in the classroom that really will now cease. I will never be surprised by these experiences anymore. Students constantly ask me how old I am, right? Like I could be 100 years old and someone will still ask me how old I am. Students ask me who is taking care of my children, if I'm teaching a night class or something like that. Students have used in my classroom derogatory language against Asian people. They've been blatantly racist towards me, sexist towards me in the classroom. In interreligious classrooms, Christian students in particular would be incredibly supremacist in their ideology in working with students who are Muslim, who are Jewish, or who didn't adhere to any religious tradition. So all of this was really jumbled up in my head when I was writing this. I wanted to write a book that contended with the experiences of the mentees that I was walking with, of myself, of my students who were trying to exist in a space that was predominantly white, predominantly Christian, and really was never intended for us, people of color and people who are religiously minoritized, and especially people who walk in both those worlds, to exist and to thrive. And I wrote this book because I really needed those who didn't live in BIPOC bodies or religiously minoritized bodies to understand and to recognize the hoops and hurdles of white supremacy and Christian, hegemony and supremacist thinking that we deal with each and every day. And it's really exhausting. It's really, really exhausting. So my goal was to help people to gain that posture and perspective in their teaching of relating to the reality of racially and religiously minoritized people in these institutions, and to help theological educators like myself and like my mentees and like my students recognize and notice really how different it is to exist as someone who is religiously minoritized or Black, Indigenous, or a person of color in spaces that will never be hospitable to us, but will use all of the optics necessary to make it seem like it is, including using our bodies for the optics and our scholarly labor for the optics. And so the book itself deals with these frameworks of how knowledge is produced and how epistemologies are built in theological education to uphold white supremacy and Christian supremacy as well. And even if an institution won't say that out loud, the ways in which minoritized people have to move through these institutions or teach in these institutions or learn in these institutions. Not only that, what we have to give up to enter, what we have to disconnect ourselves from, including our communities that sent us there in order to exist and survive, is painful, and it's actually violence. So I've divided the book into two parts, deconstruction and reconstruction, and both refers to the deconstruction and reconstruction of how we've learned to learn, how we learn to value and devalue knowledge, and pedagogy and our posture as learners. And I really believe that deconstruction and reconstruction occur simultaneously. Like, we're constantly deconstructing what we've learned and reconstructing new things in order to grow. So my hope for this book is that it's going to help theological educators and those preparing to teach, particularly doctoral students who don't take classes on pedagogy, right, or how to teach in their field and are thrown into it even before they should be, I think. Helping them prepare about, how to undo the things that have comforted us and buttressed up our privilege, and instead learn to embrace the discomfort of undoing white supremacy through anti-colonial pedagogical commitments and the uncolonizing of our institutions, so that in the future, we might possibly have a window into decoloniality, because we're not there yet.
Right. I really enjoyed both of these books. I love your structure, Christine, with the undoing competency and unbinding liberation and upsetting white Christian patriarchy and uncivilizing teaching and learning, followed by rebuilding, because too often we engage in the critique and don't try to do the reconstruction. Can you say a little bit more about uncivilizing teaching and learning?
Yes. So I remember some of my earliest memories in graduate school, like even in the master's program, was learning how to write correctly. And that always, I did English literature, creative writing, communications in my undergrad. I was always have been in love with literature. But when I entered theological education, somehow writing in the ways that were most organic to me was not correct. I wasn't supposed to tell stories about the communities that I belonged to. I was supposed to frame things in particular words and jargon that, held meaning for me only once I'd learned them, and didn't hold meaning for my community. And after I wrote my first book, which was a book on Korean American girls and their identity formation and religious formation, I gave it to my mother, who read it and said, I don't understand what you're writing about. I'm also a Korean woman, and this book is supposed to be about me and my formation, but I don't understand what you're saying. So there's a dissonance. And she called me out on it immediately. And I just thought, I can't continue to write things that people that for my community in ways that don't speak to them, that don't actually mirror their experiences, and instead package it up neatly for an academy that doesn't actually try to understand it, and instead uses it as a peculiar window in order to figure out who we are and to use us for the optics of the institution. So I think uncivilizing learning is really trying to figure out, how do we teach students to take the things that they've learned, to create out of the well of their own communities, and to bring that knowledge back to the flourishing of their own people, instead of just for the service, in the service of an academy that doesn't actually see people other than as people to be researched or studied, right? Without their collaboration. So it's in the way that we teach, in the way that we honor what students already bring to the classroom, in the ways that they write, in the ways that they, my classes are sometimes multilingual. So I know Paul talked about like English, the English language is problematic, and it's problematic because so many of us had to adopt it. And while in the adoption of it, it seeped into our indigenous languages too, and transformed the way that we understood our indigenous languages. In my classroom, I'm fluent in Korean, and my students who are Korean, who are writing things, creating things for their communities, are welcome to do that in the Korean language. I really think that's what we should be striving for, right? Like, how do we undo some of these paradigms that we've said are too hard to undo now that they're done? I think there are ways.
And talk a little bit, if you would, about what you mean by interreligious and intercultural intelligence, and why you use this terminology.
So I don't like the term intelligence at all, which was the challenge for me to try to figure out, like, how do I use this term in a way that's meaningful? I don't like it because, one of the most racist things that keeps happening to me is when people tell me I'm articulate.
Oh, you're so articulate.
Or how did you learn English so well? Well, I was born in LA, so that helps. So these are things that happened to me as a child, and continue to happen to me in adulthood, and probably will continue to happen to me throughout the rest of my life. And so the measure of intelligence that we give on someone is based on this not even invisible measuring stick that's developed in the West, of how does someone become civilized when they used to be savage, right? How does someone become kind of the definition of intelligence once they go through the doctoral program? How are they measured? Against what standard? And oftentimes the standard is the very thing that erases the very nature of who we are, and it makes us unintelligible to our communities. So I feel like intelligence in this text, I'm trying to say this is a posture. It's not a bar that you're meeting in the academy, in Western academy in particular, but instead is your work tangible to the communities in which you hold accountability, that hold your accountability, that hold you accountable? Is it meaningful for them? Is it intelligent that it can cross the barrier across in your classroom to your peers in the academy and back to those communities? And I think that ability to code switch into those spaces, for me, is what intercultural, interreligious intelligence means in this book.
Thank you. So let's bring this conversation together a little bit, starting in some practical, real world ways, and then maybe also some of our theoretical frameworks for thinking. But what aspects of decolonizing how we learn are most difficult for your students or for you? That's for either and both of you in turn.
Christina, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. Well, I always start by saying that the reason why I don't talk about decolonizing as a present day thing is because, decolonizing happens in multiple ways. There are official decolonizations of nations that have become colonies that then have to undo life and undo governance in that way, the military. But often the colonial mindset and the colonial patterns of living remain. The food changes, right? Even the way and what we eat and what we call it changes because of empire. So helping students see that is important, but I also try to help them see that decolonialism today can't exist unless we give land back to indigenous people, particularly here in North America, and in places where colonial systems still exist, where indigenous people are still living apart from the sacred spaces that they claimed before colonizers arrived, settler colonial people. So that's really what it is. And I think we have to go to indigenous people to understand what that really means. And so I do think that there is a problem with calling for decolonization, or saying that we can actually do that process here today. in a way that's faithful to the definition of sovereignty and actual land back to indigenous people. Indigenous people are telling us that how they define it. So I really think we're looking towards futures. Like, how do we build towards that eventuality where we do need to do that, where institutions are going to have to give land back, where museums are going to have to give things that they've stolen back to people that they've stolen it from. And it's a process that starts as a trickle, but we have to be able to envision that in order to move toward it. So for me, that's the most difficult piece. People want to do the decolonial thing now. And it's, even when we see nations decolonize, it's not as easy as just retracting your troops, right? It is passed down generationally, and there's trauma associated with it as well. So the hardest part is helping students see the complexity of that and almost the impossibility of it.
It's probably harder to get them to see the possibility of it than the
Oh,
impossibility
absolutely.
of it.
Yes. Yeah.
So are you suggesting that you can't decolonize the way we learn unless you're also really are seriously working at decolonizing the world, the facts on the ground?
Absolutely. I don't think for, I don't think for people who've had their land stolen, for indigenous people, that decoloniality is only in here, right? It's absolute decolonial process. And it's not about returning to before colonial settlerism, right? But it's about how do we move on once we have the things that were stolen from us. But if institutions, and we're not willing as academics to give back or to share knowledge or to learn from, or to create space for indigenous thinkers or people that have been stolen from for generations, centuries, we're not actually committed to the process of decoloniality. So it's changing those postures first to eventually be able to see what could be possible in the future.
Paul, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, two distinct things I'd like to mention. I mean, first, continuing what Christine has said. I mean, if I try and use the term sort of decolonizing as a process, because I think, again, sort of what Christine's been saying, like some institutions in particular, they want to do decolonization. Oh, look, we've put some other thinkers into our curriculum, we've done this, that, we've now decolonized. And I think, as Christine is saying, there's so much involved in this that, we're never going to get to an end of it. And of course, as soon as you perhaps sort of take one perspective into account, there'll be other perspectives which get neglected. So it's impossible, in a sense, to ever completely decolonize. It's going to be an ongoing sort of process of reflection for us. So yes, I mean, this notion of it as an ongoing process, I think, is important. The other part, and this perhaps probably relates more to me than, I don't know, as the people sort of here, but relate differently in different ways. I'm, of course, the white man sitting in Asia, teaching some of this stuff. So taking back to some of the sort of the politics of this, I do a particular session around sort of post-colonial theory, decolonization, and I start off sort of introducing the topic to my students, so I normally do, and suddenly I sort of go, hang on a minute, isn't there this thing about white men coming and telling everybody else what to think? So I then say, okay, I'm now going to leave the room, and I'm going to let you decide whether a white man can teach this to Asian students in Asia. So I walk out the room, and I let the students have a debate as to whether they will let me back in and continue teaching. So far, they always have. But I mean, it's been interesting that, and of course, when I come back and I get them to go through their thought processes on this. One time it took them about 1 hour. I was getting quite worried at the end of that as what's going on in there. And I give them sort of 10 minutes, and they've called me back in sort of over the years when I've been doing this. But I said, yeah, it's a very different process, because again, Christina's talking about sort of giving back the land, of course, in an American context, Australia, this is a big thing there. Of course, I mean, in a sense, Singapore is a post-colonial state, the land has been given back. But of course, the minds are not always decolonized. And sometimes when I teach this is the first time the students have actually heard about this. I've got sort of Asian students, they've come from a business studies background or international relations background, and they've never done this. And of course, I get sociology students and others who've done courses on this. But sometimes, they've never really thought through this. So again, it's this very odd process of, what am I doing in the middle of Asia, teaching this to Asian students. So I always sort of try and sort of balance that out. And again, of course, not to tell them how this should be done in their context, but to sort of raise these questions and get them to think, well, what might this mean in your own sort of particular situation? And actually, it's been quite interesting here because, sort of not last year, but the year before, Singapore had its 200th anniversary. And it's 200 years since this British guy called Stamford Raffles arrived here and decided to set up it as a British base. So the government got into all sorts of trouble for having this as their 200th anniversary. And it was a very interesting year, the way this was sort of debated as well. So there's all sorts of things going on that sort of add into these complexities.
So presumably you are both teaching in institutions where this kind of transformation in the way we teach and learn and how we understand religious studies is being supported, as do I. But there are surely still challenges in doing this. And I wanted to ask you to talk about those and also what wisdom you might have for folks who are teaching or learning or working as religious leaders in places where this is not supported, where this seems heretical in some fashion.
So could you just repeat what particular teaching, to decolonization or?
Right, looking at the way we have been learning about religious studies is structured by white Christian supremacy, by history of colonialism, et cetera. And, and I take for granted working in places that are looking to deconstruct that, but not everybody does.
Yeah.
So I can talk a little bit just about, yes, I work in an institution that's really longing to do this and troubling itself to try to figure out a way to do this in a way that it doesn't just sit on its hands. I find that the hardest piece of this is within communities like mine, the Korean American community, that has internalized so many of the ways of Western Christianity. Or Western forms of Christianity theologies that are then brought together with gender exclusion of, human sexual identities, and kind of unwilling to unravel that because so much of it has now been tied to cultural identity here post-immigration. So a more conservative evangelical Christianity in those communities is harder to break through. And the problem is, it's almost like the West is knocking back on those same doors and saying, now everything that we taught you before is wrong, so undo it now that we've asked you to do it. And the people inside those buildings are like, we already gave all that up for you in the beginning, right? We had all of these things. We gave those up because you told us that the Christian, white Jesus doesn't want that. So we gave that up, and we've been living in this particular way for so long. And now you're telling us to give this up again at your behest. So it's how do you dialogue? How do you really create sustained transformation without becoming a neo-colonizer, right? Back to your own people. So that's truly my struggle. I think the academy is a different kind of a space in the institutions that we serve that's more open to how do we think about new ways of being and deconstruct. However, sometimes those teachings, those colonial mindsets have been taught so well, so deeply internalized that it's so hard to undo. And I recognize that in my students as they come through seminary as well. Like it is really a breaking down. And sometimes that breaking down also breaks down contact with communities that have nurtured them, which is really painful.
Yeah, and I can very much recognize what Christine said. And again, coming here, one of my first meetings sort of here after I arrived, because I'm in a centre a centre for interreligious relations here, and we work quite closely with some of the religious communities. My boss took me to see a former Anglican bishop here who used to be the head of a theological college. And basically, for about an hour, he ranted on about how Western Christianity has become corrupt and sort of LGBT stuff completely abhorrent. And, you know, I'd been in the country about, you know, sort of a week, and I was in no position where I could sort of say to this guy, hey, you know, you've got this all wrong. I mean, he's an extremely good biblical scholar in his own right. So I think, yeah, sort of what Christina said, you know, there's a lot of sort of stuff that has been learnt, if you like, from certain forms of Western Christianity that are now deeply embedded into traditions and ways of thinking. I mean, here in particular, sort of many of the Christian churches, I mean, they're deeply sort of implicated with sort of American Southern Baptists because they've got all of the money. So this is sort of where a lot of the learning is coming from. So yeah, I mean, that is always going to be a, if you like, an uphill sort of struggle to sort of, you know, slowly start sort of conversations. And, you know, certainly sort of in my context, I mean, there's no way, I mean, if I sort of push back against this, you know, I would have been the white colonizing bad guy immediately. So there's no way I could even sort of start that conversation at that time. After 6 years, I think they slightly trust me more now, so I'm allowed to say some things which I couldn't have said 6 years ago. But yeah, and that's an issue. But I mean, also just within institutions more generally, I mean, there's always ways to sort of start these conversations. I mean, in my old job, something I did in our courses, we sort of had a modern theology course, which was taught to our sort of upper-level undergraduate students. And I introduced a global Christianities course, and we then sort of like alternated these from year to year. So, you know, one time it would be mainly like this white sort of European sort of heritage. The next year we do sort of this more global course, and even the white Christian modern theologians course, I had a few more sort of like liberation theologians sort of put in there, and some of the sort of the Chinese theology was also breaking into it. It's also modern theology. It fitted within the outline of the course. So I mean, there's always ways to sort of find places that these can fit in to them, and sometimes it's just, you know, adding extra sessions on the courses, which I think is not entirely adequate. But at least it introduces to students sort of fact there are ways of looking at it. There are alternatives sort of out there. And of course, there's all sorts of stuff gets pushed back against in various ways. Again, I handed one of these courses on else. The person teaching it decided it wasn't relevant anymore in, I don't know, 2010 or whenever it was, that, you know, no, that's not, we've done this, so we don't need to teach it anymore. And I was completely shocked. So yeah, there's all sorts of stuff that, yes, various white Western Christian men, I'm one of them, of course, but you know, lots of things that people like me have problems with.
So I'm going to invite folks to type their questions into the chat, and as they're thinking of them and framing them and typing them, let me offer this question to you both. A lot of people on the call often teach in interreligious studies specifically, and your books treat interreligious studies not as a siloed subfield of religious studies, but rather present a religiously plural world as a central reality that has to shape the way we study religion or do theological education at all. So I wondered if you might be able to talk a little bit more about that idea and its implications for those of us who do teach in interreligious studies.
Go for it, Paul.
Okay, sure, thanks. Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I've had, in one sense, I said this is written basically as a straight religious studies book there to be used in like standard religious studies courses. And I think this interreligious studies sort of question is something which is now, you know, become part of the mainstream conversation on this. It's not something that can be ignored anymore, and sort of interreligious studies is becoming a lot bigger for this. So for instance, my chapter 3 on sort of lived religion, I mean, sort of this syncretism question runs all the way through it, because there is no religious tradition, no mainstream normative belief or practice which is not syncretic in some way, shape or form. Now, of course, part of this is going to upset some people when you say that, and people get very defensive about their sort of tradition.
Religion is pure.
Yes, absolutely. So, but I mean, I said it can't be avoided when you're trying to sort of work in an academic scholarly way around this. And yes, I mean, I think partly because my training, I did my first degree in religious studies and theology, which is one of those things you're not quite sort of meant to do. So I had like sort of the Christian side and all the other religions on there. And this sort of interrelationship between them, sort of these movements back and forth, has always fascinated me. So it's partly, you know, yeah, sort of, I don't know, sort of 30 odd plus years now, sort of leading from my sort of studies up into this. But I said it's become so mainstream that, I mean, from an interreligious studies perspective, yes, you know, teaching religious studies is interreligious studies in a sense now, to recognize these dynamic encounters. And of course, I said, you know, so hopefully sort of the book will do that. Of course, I've got particular chapters around sort of diversity and sort of dialogue and other things, which again, you wouldn't maybe find in many traditional religious studies courses. So, I mean, there is like an eye to people doing sort of interreligious stuff in this already. And again, the way they're written with this coming out there. But I think it's building upon sort of such a corpus of sort of literature which speaks about these connections that you simply can't avoid it. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question. But again, it's not to be apologetic about doing interreligious studies, you know. To understand religion is to understand the interreligious nature. I mean, all the way back to Max Muller. He who knows one knows none. You know, if Max Muller said it, it can't be, well, it could be very wrong, but if Max Muller said it, then yeah, we can defend it.
It might have some insight worth reflecting on. It still could be wrong. Christine, you want to jump in?
Sure. I love what Gloria Andaluza talks about, you know, as borderlands. And I really see interreligious studies as being, and those borderland spaces are really vibrant and flex much more creatively and beautifully than rigid religious spaces, like what you're saying, Rachel, like the pure religious, whatever that is. And I also teach a class called Global Christian Spiritualities. And it really helping students see, and I teach at an institution where it's predominantly Christians, progressive Christians, who still see Christianity as very like a rigid way that's practiced in the same way around the world. And it just isn't. And I think that just even seeing art, the way that Christian art emerges in different parts of the world, helps people realize that, oh my gosh, there's indigeneity everywhere. We just haven't called it such, right? It's been subsumed. And so how do we become, particularly in Christian-oriented institutions like mine, open to that possibility that there's syncretism everywhere, that there's indigeneity everywhere, and embrace it, and help students in particular make those choices to recover the things that have been stolen in terms of epistemologies of indigenous spirituality and religion as part of their Christianity today. How do we make space that says you should be doing that? You should absolutely be doing that, rather than pushing them away from that towards a more acceptable form of Christianity. And that can really seem heretical to a lot of people. And not only to, you know, I want to say also to communities of color, it can seem kind of heretical too, who have adopted particularly white Western forms of Christian understanding about their own traditions.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't think I'm missing them. I assume people heard the invitation to send them, but of course I have tons of questions. I can keep asking, but let me give you both an opportunity to ask a question of each other. And I just see a question, which I will read while you think about whether you have questions you want to ask each other.
Paul, I love your book. I've said this. I want to know which chapter was the hardest for you to write, in terms of like how to, not just the writing was hard, but trying to untangle, right? The topic that you were trying to make digestible for your students. Which one was the one that you wrestled with the most?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, it's so hard to say. Can I pick two of them and cheat?
Yeah.
Actually, one of them. Well, actually, they're back to back. Is chapters 9 and 10 in the book. One of them is the gender chapter 10, Gender, Feminism, Sexuality and Religion. I mean, partly, I remember the first draft of that. I mean, each chapter is capped about 10,000 words. It was about 16,000 words, and there was more stuff I wanted to put in there. So it was one of those horrible chopping jobs and trying to sort of get everything I thought was essential in there, while sort of, also making it flow and be accessible to read as well, which is something I hope I've managed to achieve in this. Actually, I particularly remember that because I had a particular research assistant who was here with me at that time. And, she sort of basically saw this chapter in my first sort of draft and then sort of all the way through. So I think it was a great experience for her to sort of like see this process. Yeah, the other chapter is chapter 9, Bodies, that material, religion, embodiment and materiality. And in a sense, it does far too much work because, of course, material religion has to be in there, but of course, it is, the bodies, the books, the buildings, all of this is so key to what it does. But it's also like it's a big theory chapter in the book. There's a whole question of materiality. And I take this sort of on board, if you like, that of course there's the linguistic turn, there's also the material turn. So getting, if you like, the theory, and of course a lot of this is really involved and complex, and getting that to a position where students could come in and understand it was important. And again, of course, I mean, just as a teaching point, I mean, I think there's some stuff in there that now I teach my students, because it's not relevant to them, it's relevant to religious studies students. I just tell my students, okay, you've read that bit, but don't worry too much about it. I don't care if you understand that bit, focus on some other bits within this chapter, because this is what's important to this course. But yeah, I mean, getting both the theory and the content into that, I mean, yeah, that was a real struggle.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
We did get a question in from Emmanuel, who asked us to think back to the conversation about decolonizing education and that it means various things to various people. Are there things that you've come across in interreligious studies in your research using this idea about decolonizing in ways that you disagree with? Right, where somehow this very effort is being distorted or misunderstood.
I think for me, it's when qualitative research, whether that's around education or elsewhere, doesn't actually incorporate the partnership of the people that you're researching. Right. So when there's a community that you're working with and trying to understand how they're functioning, how they're practicing religion and spirituality or interreligiosity, and they're not partnered with you in that research to actually do that work. And also if they don't benefit from that labor directly, and I'm talking about, yes, if they don't financially benefit is what I'm saying. I think that in itself is a colonizing endeavor under the guise of decoloniality. So just working with people and making room for them isn't enough. I think that on the back end, right, how do they benefit from that work that you've done? How are they compensated? It really comes down to that. And that's where a lot of it I find falls short.
Thank you. Looking to see another question. Nope, not another question. So,
so
go ahead, Paul.
If I could kind of answer that with my question to sort of Christine, because one time I actually wrote a paper in which I used the term reconstruction, and I was criticized by one scholar for sort of being oppressive of Black Americans because I'd used the word reconstruction, of course, in American history, the Reconstruction period. Mm-hmm. And he said, no one can ever use reconstruction again in the whole history of the world because of this. And I was just like, sort of, hang on a minute. I'm in the middle of Asia and people here use this word quite happily, and lots of people use this word quite happily. Why should what happens in America dictate how anybody else in the world uses language? And I just wanted to get, you'll put reconstruction in there from an American context. Did you have any thoughts about using that particular word?
No, I mean, I discuss American exceptionalism a lot in my book. And how we have to it's really hard, even for myself, to orient myself away from the US, the politics that govern us every day, and to think more expansively, and also to think about everything out, not to always constantly think about the paradigm of the world through US militarism, for instance, which reconstruction and construction is related to, right? So I use a lot of words that I don't fully love in my book, but I try to explain like why I'm using it and what role that it has there. I do think that particularly in the US, using words that have been used in the past to keep people oppressed and minoritized has to be done really carefully and with permission in many ways, and at least in negotiation. So recognizing the histories that it has. So, but again, we can't just map that experience across the globe as the generative experience for everyone. So, yeah.
Well, this conversation is very rich and could go on for a long time, but I did promise people we'd be done at 10. So thank you, Paul and Christine, very much for your books, Understanding Religion and Decolonial Futures. We are all the better for them. I again thank you all for being here and invite people who are directing centers or working at centers or with interreligious organizations who want to think together for 5-10 minutes about possible synergies. Stay on the call, but I'm going to stop recording now and wish you all a good day, afternoon, evening. Take care.